English. I am an artist, youth advocate, and restorative theater program coordinator for Mirror Image Arts. So tonight, I also get to be your host and moderator for the Disrupt 2023 Conversation to Commitment. Before we get started, I would like for everyone to comment in the chat box where they're tuning in from. Beautiful. And as we get started, I want to also take a moment to thank our partners who have made this event possible: Captive Brand, Reanimate, Intelligent Demand, Longmont Community Justice Partnership, and the National Center for Youth Law. And now, I would like to introduce our advocacy manager, Julie Rada, for our land acknowledgement.
Thanks, Kiana. We want to recognize the indigenous peoples of the unceded land known as Denver, the Lakota, Ute, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Shoshone, and others, as the original stewards of the land, water, plants, and animals who have called this place home. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, as well as recognize that these people are still here. Since our activities are shared digitally on the internet, we also would like to take a moment to consider the legacy of colonization embedded within the technologies, the structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We are using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many indigenous communities. I invite you to join us in acknowledging all this complexity, as well as our shared responsibility to make the best use of this time here together, and for each of us to reflect on our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship. This nation has yet to address this original harm and its legacy formally. And as we'll discuss here, we've continued to heap cycles of harm upon this original harm, cementing a punitive system of justice that perpetuates colonialism and attempts to erase violence. Later in our conversation, we will discuss justice practices that originate in Indigenous culture and those approaches to addressing harm. Thank you for taking this moment with us.
Joining us. I will now turn it over to our youth board member and program alum, Dyson Campbell.
Thank you for joining us for our 4th annual Virtual Disrupt event. Tonight, our panel of youth advocates will take us from conversation to commitment. Our panelists and moderator will engage us in conversation about alternatives to the punitive justice system and will activate us to commit. A commitment to be part of a movement that leads us to a more just society for all. My name is Dyson Campbell. I am a youth board member here at Mirror Image Arts. As a board member, I have the opportunity to advocate for youth just like me, who have found themselves in the system with no way out. When I was 14, I got in trouble with the law. I ended up at a place called Shadow House. I felt scared, and it was difficult to be away from my family. I felt as though people looked at me like I was a monster and not a human. After I'd gotten out of Shadow House, I ended up at a place called Third Way Center and was introduced to MIA. At first, it felt like it was crazy and it just didn't make sense. But then I began to realize the people around me didn't look at me the same way. They looked at me as a person and someone who could grow and become better than what I was before. I was able to connect with those around me, which due to my past, I wasn't able to do before that. I was able to feel loved and loved back, and having that opportunity to be in MIA has helped me become a healthier and more stable person. Being able to find peace within myself, I will forever be grateful and happy that I've had that second chance. By being here tonight, you are supporting youth voice and those that have struggled similar to me. And now it is my honor to introduce a talented artist, Mirror Image Arts Program alumni, Jason Ruby.
Have you ever wanted to find what's on the other side? Free your spirit, fix your broken mind. Is it blank or is it rage? Heaven or hell? If I died, would the tears cry? I praise God that I fell. Would it right my mistakes and mend my regrets? Would it make my mama happy? Would it make my mama sad? I'm alone in my head. God, could you guide me tonight? Put my feet on my path so I'm walking right. Put some money in my pocket so I could give it to mine. Sometimes I can't see what you want me to see. Sometimes I feel like you want me to bleed. but it feels like when you want me to talk, you've been waiting my whole damn life.
Thank you, Jason, and welcome everyone. That poem was written by one of our youth at Lookout Youth Services Center, where they created original poetry and drawings that made a zine called Contraband. If you are just joining us today, I am Kiana English, your moderator, host, and restorative theater program coordinator at Mirror Image Arts. Mirror Image Arts' purpose and passion is to disrupt the school to prison pipeline through participatory theater. We support young people in schools and along the full scope of the criminal legal system, from diversion to incarceration to returning home. We work with individuals, groups, and organizations to make lasting systemic change through advocacy. Tonight, I am so excited to be in conversation with an exciting panel of community leaders and youth advocates discussing justice, the limitations of our current system, which relies on retributive justice, and then shifting into a generative conversation about all that justice can be in addressing harm, in promoting accountability and healing, and in restoring and transforming balance in communities. For this, we get to use our imaginations, which is an essential tool for creating social change. We're so glad you're here. We encourage you all to engage with us in the comments section, and our staff will provide support in the chat box. Before introducing our panelists, I would like to give a huge thank you to Jason Ruby, our Restorative Youth alum, and Dyson Campbell, also our Restorative Youth alum and youth board member, for offering their time, talent, and support. Joining us in tonight's conversation is Ramone Sanders, who serves as the Restorative Justice Training Manager at Longmont Community Justice Partnership, Dana Walters Flores, the Campaign Coordinator at the National Center of Youth Law, and Julie Rada, who serves as the Advocacy Manager at Mirror Image Arts. We like to start by talking a bit about the status quo, which locates the cause of harm in an individual's choice to do something harmful. It's common to hear about good guys and bad guys in this way of thinking about harm. Dana, how do you see retributive justice manifesting in your work? What works and what doesn't?
First of all, thank you, Mirror Image Arts. Thank you, everyone on the panel. Thank you, Jason and Dustin and Julie and the whole team for the opportunity to be here. I guess I'll just talk about some of the most recent experiences that I've, had the privilege to be part of in Colorado. I get to participate in something called the Colorado Youth Justice Collaborative. That's the shirt I'm wearing. And we convene monthly to bring together directly impacted young people, family members, advocates, educators, policy folks who are committed to advancing youth justice policy reform to fight the criminalization of Black and Brown youth and to expand alternatives to incarceration and detention, to fight the school to prison pipeline, and to fight adultification. And out of that space, policy initiatives will come up. It's kind of an incubator space where people will have ideas, and then the collaborative as a whole can kind of leverage the resources that we have in our networks to help advance policy. And just this past year, one good example of a campaign that folks all kind of coalesced behind and got involved in was a campaign to reform expulsion law in Colorado, because right now expulsion law is really driving the school to prison pipeline, because schools are expelling students anytime they're arrested for any level of conduct. Under the current statute, schools have that discretion that they can expel a student if they get arrested for something that happens off school grounds, outside of school hours, that has no connection to school safety or to the safety of students and staff. So a student could vandalize a 7-Eleven across town from where they live over the summer, or at least be arrested for that and be alleged to have done that, and they could return to school in August or September and be told that they have been expelled or that expulsion proceedings have been initiated against them because of that arrest. And schools, when we organized and tried to rewrite that statute and make it a little harder to expel students, really responded in a very aggressive and fear-based way and said essentially, we have to be able to punish, otherwise students will never learn. And the irony there for me is, if you expel a student in Colorado, that means that every school district in the state has the right to deny them admission for a full year. So actually, if you expel a student, they will never learn. So that's kind of the way that I see retributive justice playing out day to day, right? Is that these things that we're doing in the name of, somehow teaching young people accountability are actually just punishing them and producing outcomes that are the opposite of what we say we want. If we want to help young people become, productive and law-abiding and compassionate older youth and adults and ultimately parents, we are not approaching justice in a way that is reasonably calculated to give them the opportunity to do that. We're just punishing.
You labeled something very interesting, that most of the adults have a fear-based practice, and I'm wondering, what would it mean to take away that fear? How would you take away fear from those adults?
Is that a question for me?
Yes, for you.
Okay, sure. I think there are others on this panel who will also have really good ideas about this. But I have to be honest and say that this is a harder one for me to answer because I'm not afraid of children, right? I am afraid of being hurt or being harmed personally, and I also recognize that that's part of moving through the world as a human, that at times I'm going to hurt or harm other people, generally without meaning to, but I'm going to because I make mistakes. And so I also believe that children and youth make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes might harm other children and youth, or they might harm adults, or they might harm me. But I don't walk around feeling afraid of that.
Mm.
I also don't think that we as adults should ever endorse a narrative that we need to be afraid of children or that we should be afraid of students. And so, like, I see in my work right now that, like, Denver Public Schools just surveyed all of their employees and asked all of their employees to fill out like pre-filled multiple choice questions that said, tell us what you're most afraid of. A, students bringing a gun to school. B, students bringing a knife to school. C, a student blowing up the school. D, a student assaulting you in your classroom. There was not an option on that survey for a staff person to say, I am afraid of students being criminalized. I am afraid that we are responding to students in a way that is assuming that they are dangerous and that that's inherently harmful and outside of the purview of what we are tasked to do as educators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I might jump in here actually and just say, like, we adults are products of our culture, and we've come up with a really limited set of options for addressing harm. And so those adults, and also I just would say that I think, like, a lawyer might call that a leading question, right? Where there's like, and that when our only options, the only available option is, when you feel unsafe, is to call the police rather than to call a friend, a neighbor for support, or even to just sort of check in with what is the kernel of that fear. Yeah, I think that it just shows how we as adults there's this intergenerational thing happening where we have inherited certain stories and such a limited set of options. And I think I'm happy to kick this over to you, Ramone, too, since you're working with youth who've had contact with law enforcement as such too.
Yes. Thank you, Julie, for adding to that. And that completely leads us to Ramone about at LCJP, you work with many youth who have experienced direct contact with law enforcement. And I just want to know, what have you observed in these youth and their responses to law enforcement?
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you, Kiana. And thank you, Mir Image Arts, for inviting myself and LCJP to be a part of this event tonight to talk about the work that we do, as well as my own personal passion for the work. And to Dana's point around fear for youth and the work that we do, I had a mentor once tell me that was very influential in the way that I viewed the work and the youth that I worked for. And that was, he pretty much, had this come to reality moment where he just stated brief, like basically, if you're afraid of the youth that you're serving, then you're in the wrong profession. You need to find a new job. And I had to reflect on that, because he was absolutely right. That type of approach and that lens when serving young folks doesn't really bode well with cultivating authentic relationships to be able to support young folks, adults, anyone who is in need of support that is attempting to break structures and cycles, or generations of cycles of oppression. So thank you for that, Dana. And yeah, I'm excited to be here. But in regards to how young folks that LCJP interacts with in our partnership with law enforcement, oftentimes, well, most of the youth that are referred to our community group conferencing process, which is a community restorative justice process, have a law enforcement interaction that is a ticketable offense, and that can be misdemeanors or felonies as long as it's not immediately arrestable. So if there's not active violence involved, or some other serious crime that might need to apprehend someone in that moment, they are referred to our community restorative justice process. Oftentimes, the young folks that are referred to us, there is a common trend amongst their interaction. And initially, it's what is their level of responsibility to take accountability for what they are alleged to have done, right? Why they're being ticketed in the first place. So if they are showing a significant ability to take responsibility and then want to take accountability for what has happened, the harm that has been caused, be it tangible or intangible, right? Physical or personal. Then that determines how, if they volunteer to be a part of our process. There is obviously dynamics of power, oppression, race when it comes to certain young folks being referred. I can't speak to the facts of their interaction, but when they have the opportunity to express themselves within the process of the conference and then the conference itself, they have the opportunity to talk about what their experience was throughout the interaction. And some cases have involved stories and experiences where folks felt that they were singled out or that they were profiled. And oftentimes that gets in the way of that young person or adult then wanting to take responsibility and accountability for what they have done. We slide in, well, it seems that they may slide into what we have socially been, I guess, what's been promoted for us throughout our socialization and not taking responsibility for what has happened in order to mitigate what our punishment might be. So oftentimes that kind of punitive or retributive punishment style approach then causes young folks and adults to not want to take accountability or responsibility for their actions.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ramone. And that was a beautiful answer and makes me think about what we can do to create safe spaces for youth to feel like they can take accountability and responsibility, and how we need to take responsibility in making those spaces. Julie, I'm going to move to you. Can you share a bit about the financial and human cost of retributive justice?
Yeah, thank you. I think, well, Dana and Ramon both kind of touched on this. I think practically, I just want to say, first of all, it doesn't work. I think what Ramon was just saying, by placing young people or adults, for that matter, into an oppressive system, a system where they feel like they have to fight for their survival in any kind of sort of like lockup facility, or when they experience um, the police, right? The police are scary. They have power. Then that sort of highlights the need to sort of survive rather than drop into taking accountability. That requires a certain level of safety. And the criminal legal system has multiple failure points, from arrest to courts to sentencing to incarceration. And all of these have racial and socioeconomic biases baked into them. The data shows that violence is driven by shame, isolation, exposure to violence, an inability to meet one's economic needs. And how we currently are doing retributive justice with prison and heavy fines and fees, things like that, all of those things exacerbate or create these issues for people. So the US's National Violence Prevention Strategy actually relies on a tool that has as its core the main drivers of violence. It's very counterintuitive. We see this, there's so much recidivism. The recidivism rates are really high. So what we're doing simply just doesn't work. So practically, we'll just say that, in the adult system, it's up to 77%. The recidivism rate, this is from about 2005, after 5 years. With youth in Colorado, the recidivism rate is about 41%. That's more recent data. And then, of course, the majority of the people who end up in adult prison arrive in adult prison between the ages of 18 and 25. So they're developmentally very much still young adults. And we have to ask, were they imprisoned before as youth? Did they go through multiple placements in the foster system? Have they experienced any kind of mental or emotional barriers or disabilities, homelessness, jail, incarceration of a parent? Essentially, we are hurting some of the most hurt people in our society. And when we understand that surviving violence is one of the biggest predictors of later causing violence, which of course is not across the board, we just recognize we're harshly punishing some of the most traumatized kids and people in our society rather than caring for them. And about 1 in 10 kids are reportedly what would be called poly victims, meaning they have survived many instances of violence in their youth, not just single instances, but complex traumas, repeated traumas. And then we put them into the hands of the state to replicate those traumas. And I just know, I can feel in my bones that locking people up or abandoning them, and especially how we do and for the lengths of time that we do, is inhumane and unethical. And then, of course, they're committed to this, to paraphrase Michelle Alexander, this invisible permanent underclass where they face all kinds of negative outcomes and collateral consequences essentially the rest of their life. So there's a high human cost. We're not taking care, as a culture, we're not valuing and taking care of some of the most hurt people and instead we're actually investing in systems that replicate harm. Yeah. So I think too, I'm curious, going back to specifically young people, Dana, you mentioned something that I think might be worth sharing with the folks tuning in, this concept of adultification, because I think there's this, as I said, there's all these things that happen to young people as they come up, and we often lose sight of the fact that they're children. And I'd just be curious if you could say a little bit more, maybe about that, either of you, say a little bit more about that.
I can speak on adultification.
Yeah, I couldn't hear
Could you hear me?
Dana. Yeah, I can hear you, and also, I'm also just
Oh,
curious
yeah.
about this punitive justice
There
in
we go.
schools. So anyone can jump in.
Sorry, I was muted. I'm happy to
Okay.
speak to that for a second. Um, my bad. And I would invite Ramon also to follow up. This I think is something that probably LCJP sees a lot, and something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, because I've been working with a pretty broad-based coalition of folks from around Colorado on a policy campaign to raise the minimum age of juvenile court jurisdiction from 10, where it is now, up to 13. So we're in year 2 of a legislative campaign to pass law that would essentially get 10, 11, and 12-year-olds out of the juvenile justice system and just relocate the response to concerning behavior in that age group in communities and families, in schools, where many people would argue it belongs, rather than in courtrooms and in DA diversion programs or in any kind of court-ordered supervision. And the tricky part about that is that we're trying to approach the people who run the systems of punishment for children and say, hey, these are children, right? They're 4th and 5th and 6th graders, and they're going through
Mm-hmm.
a time of development in their life, emotionally, socially, in terms of their brain development, where some of their behavior is not volitional, right? Like, yes, they know right from wrong to some degree, and yes, they have control over how their body moves, but they also are developing new pathways in their brain and learning new ways of being and identifying. And they're kids, and they're going to act out in lots of ways that are actually age appropriate and developmentally appropriate, that sometimes are going to sort of break our rules as adults or make us uncomfortable as adults. And if we respond to children who are that young as if they should be held accountable in the same way that a person who's 21, 22, 23, 31, 32, 33, that's crazy, right? Like, it is reasonable for us as adults to be concerned about behavior that frightens us. But if what we really want is to help children to change those behaviors, we will never accomplish that by criminalizing them and treating them the same as adults. What we're doing is just like ushering them into the juvenile justice system, which is the front door of the adult criminal legal system. And we know that that system is related to the legacy of slavery. We know that that system involves many intersecting systems of oppression that are intended to subjugate and dehumanize people of all ages. And if we do that to children, right, not only do we treat them like adults, but we also treat them like adults who are throwaway people.
Yeah, Kiana, if we have time, I can probably just add a little something. Um, yeah, thank you, Dana and Julie. Yeah, it's like the revolving door. Um, there's this idea right around how do you support young folks, and we've had a punitive system, right, that's been cultivated for generations now, and we still have an issue, or maybe some will say this issue is growing. Maybe we should take a different approach. Along with our work in partnership with the Longmont municipality and law enforcement and children, youth, and family services, there is also support that we add within school settings, as well as working with school resource officers in providing opportunities to learn about restorative tools on a spectrum of preventative to intervention. So we believe that we start at the basic level of cultivating authentic relationship, right? When we can step into cultivating authentic relationship with small bits of vulnerability, addressing concerns in the moment, and speaking from a place of curiosity rather than power over. If we can get to the power with phase, maybe we can. The idea is that we enhance the learning community through these processes and these rituals, so that when there are more crucial, maladaptive behaviors or situations that happen, they can be addressed in a way that we don't normally address them, right? In a way that leans into mitigating shame and blame, and truly figuring out processes that help that young person understand how their actions affect the community as well, and how they can take responsibility for that and then repair those harms, and then fully be reintegrated back into the society in ways to thrive and to add their value to the community. And we do have to say that with our community partners, especially with law enforcement, that they are leaning into that work, as well as St. Vrain Valley School District. But once again, this opportunity to come together within a circle, accountability circle process, benefits law enforcement as well as young folks in the community, because we all get to hear the experience of the folks within that circle who have been affected by that situation. So young folks also get to hear about the challenges that law enforcement face when their senses are heightened in a particular situation or what have you, that maybe they didn't consider before. But law enforcement also gets to hear how maybe their actions and the way they approach interactions can be intimidating or also traumatic. So it's a benefit for everyone in the community. I would say the way punishment is being handled across the board, with suspensions and expulsions, lead to obviously a pipeline to prison. But there are wonderful models out there that are working towards finding pathways for young folks.
Beautiful. Thank you. And as we move forward into how we can handle that with restorative justice, but before we do that, we would love to get some audience engagement. So, oh my gosh, a good friend of mine, Michael Vord, puts, I had no idea about the expulsion law. Thank you for the information, Dana. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Michael, for asking that question or commenting. I'll say commenting. Kim says, as a teacher in Florida, I'm super curious about our expulsion laws here. And then Nicholas says, Ramone speaks about how can a youth trust you, have their best interests in mind if you don't trust the youth with the same thing. Good point, Nicholas. Andrea, so grateful that the bill Dana is referencing to restorative. Sorry, guys, I do not have my glasses on, so this is going to be interesting. It's referencing the raise the age youth from 10 to 13, made it out of Senate Judiciary yesterday. NYCL is doing powerful work. Congratulations. Yes. Okay. So, Lauren, I think we're going to have to start texting these to me. Thanks. It's actually Emily, Travis's wife and Voco's executive assistant. Glad to be here tonight. Yes, they made it bigger. I see it. I see it. Thanks, Amy. Oh my goodness. Yes, Dana. Such a great point. Treating them with some adult rules, and they are not adults. Such a simple concept that I definitely miss sometimes. But you said it so well. Thank you. Thank you for those wonderful comments. Please continue to chat with us. It's now bigger font. I'll be able to read it and it will go smoother the second time around. Okay, so as we move on to the conversation about restorative justice. So you might wonder, Kiana, you kept saying you're the restorative theater program coordinator. What does that mean? Well, restorative theater is an applied theater program in diversion, youth legal system, and step down facilities. In this program, we use theater to teach belonging and social emotional learning skills and build relationships as trusted adults. So I'm going to go to Ramone first. We want to acknowledge that restorative justice is a set of practices rooted in original and indigenous relationships to land and one another. Ramone, why do you think restorative justice is important and how did you get into it?
Most definitely. By far, especially at LCJP, we always want to recognize that um, the core elements of our restorative justice models are rooted in indigenous culture, even though it may be a Western colonized version of that within our criminal justice system. The idea of utilizing the collective wisdom of folks that come from from the Longmont community, as well as folks that were affected in whatever harm had occurred, as well as the idea of having this accountability circle to welcome the person back into community, utilizing their strengths and to also um, explore their value is how we pay homage to staying true to that theory and that practice. For myself, I got involved with restorative practice in 2014-15 through a 10-month program that was geared towards cultivating inclusive leaders in the nonprofit industry. And throughout that 10 months, we practiced um, utilizing connection circles every Fridays, after utilizing also learning about the isms as well as health equity topics, to then share each other's experiences, because the cohort was a diverse group of folks that had intersections of many different identities that these health equity learning opportunities all addressed. So naturally, at our nonprofits we worked at, and then the work we did with each other within our neighborhood community work, teamwork together, there was conflict that arose. And from that conflict, we had an opportunity to engage in a healing circle over a weekend. It was just intensive circles for 3 days straight, in which we addressed a lot of conflict. And we left there with a refreshed, renewed sense of relationship, and continue to cultivate relationship and transform conflict in ways that I didn't even see possible. And personally, I myself learned a lot about what it takes to address some of the internal work to be able to cultivate a restorative mindset. So that has always pushed me to continue to learn more and to always find opportunities to practice and grow. And this work is really passionate and dear to my personal and professional ambitions. And so that's pretty much it. Did I answer the question, Kiana? I think that's about it for me.
That did answer the question. I do have a follow up for
Okay.
you on that question.
Yep.
Why do you think addressing conflict is the solution when it comes to the circle? Why is the circle so transformative with that?
Most definitely. And I mean, I would say it's just a way that we step into a process and a ritual that is unique to us, but I don't believe it's unique to the cultures and our ancestors. As you mentioned, there's cultures all over the globe that have elements of restorative practices using a circle process to transform conflict and welcome those folks back into the community, to provide whatever value they brought to the community. And I understand now, obviously, that everyone was important then when we think about the kind of life they were living, so it's important to have everyone contribute. But for like example, the Navajo Nation utilized a talking out method in which they used the collective wisdom of the circle and used a particular person within the clan or the tribe that was known as a person that spoke well, right, that could hold the space. And they would invite those affected in the tribe or the entire tribe to let that person know how much they were valued, all the good things that they brought to the tribe as well, and then address the harm that had happened, right, and how it affected those that were impacted, and then what was the plan to move forward. And our model at LCJP is modeled after New Zealand's model for family restorative justice and their criminal justice efforts. So there's a bit of social science behind it, and the scripts that we use that allow for the opportunity and the space for even those that have caused that harm to address what is needed for them to be successful as well. And I think that's part of the magic of the circle. Myself, like, once again, this particular experience in the circle with my colleagues back in Wisconsin and during this weekend long retreat was the first time I was able to speak about my younger brother's story, who we lost to gun violence, right? And by sharing that story, a particular colleague that came from the same place as me, that had a similar story as me, got something she needed from that story as well. Right. And we both connected there. And it was like we were both brought there in that moment, in that space. And I was able to speak about his story in a way that was more empowering than it was the trauma of it. Whereas, and that was the first time I shared it with other people that weren't like really close family members, like my older brother, right? And then she unfortunately came from a similar background, kind of the same area, and was familiar with this particular story, and received some closure from that as well. So unscripted, not expected, and it's just something that happens when you cultivate community and relationship,
Thank you,
which the
Ramon.
circle can provide. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for answering my question and also giving us a beautiful insight of yourself as well. As we move on to Dana, can you give an example or a case study of a situation that benefited from restorative justice? How can schools use or other institutions use restorative justice?
Yeah, thank you. There are quite a few that come to mind, but I think one that jumps out for me is one that's somewhat local here. There was a situation that involved a young person that I had the privilege of working alongside a few years ago. And they were pretty young. They were, I think, 11 at the time that this happened, but they found a BB gun and thought it was cool and picked it up and went with a friend and went into a big store here in the city where I live. And they were just like wandering around in the store, and they tucked the BB gun in the waistband of their shorts, and they're wandering around in the store. So of course, store security sees this on the video cameras, and they can't tell it's a BB gun because it looks like a real gun. And so they call law enforcement, and law enforcement comes and responds. And a law enforcement officer like rounds a corner into the aisle where this 11-year-old kid is, and comes face to face with them. And the kid has sort of a trauma reaction because they're a little kid, and pulls the gun. And the law enforcement officer pulls his gun and points it at them. And there's like this split second thing that happens in his mind, the law enforcement officer, where he looks at the kid and says, I have a kid at home this age, and I'm in this situation, I'm supposed to shoot. But something in his brain said, I can't do this. I don't have enough information. And so in any case, he reached out and took the gun away from the 11-year-old kid who gave it up because it was a toy, right? And diffused that situation. That young person still got charged, right? We can all understand why they might get charged with something. But it was actually the police officer who suggested, sort of over a period of months, that he didn't really know that what he was asking for was a restorative process, but he suggested that he might like to sit down with this young person and be able to express to them and to their family how close he came to shooting and how much like grief and guilt he had been living with for months, imagining what it would have been like had he shot. Not to say like you're a horrible kid and you were so wrong to do that, but just to help the young person understand kind of what the incident had meant for him as the officer involved. Um, and initially, the young person was like, "Hell no, I don't want to do that." And and it was like hard to kind of work through their resistance, but as often happens with organizations that are skilled at facilitating restorative justice processes like LCJP, the point people were able to kind of work through that, and they figured out that this child had had a really close friend who had been killed by the actions of law enforcement just a few months prior to this incident. And so they had all this sort of skepticism around engaging, like sitting down and meeting a police officer, and they thought that that they didn't want to be part of that. And it took some time for them to get to a point where they had willingness to do that, right? But that process ultimately had a really deep impact on both of them because, among other things, this was a kid who tended to have contact with law enforcement a lot, not for high level criminal behaviors, but because they had a trauma response that involved like kind of running out of their home and climbing on top of buildings. And they kept being sort of like, kitten up a tree phone calls to police, like, oh, this kid has climbed on top of their school again, or they've climbed on top of a building downtown, because that's what they would do when they felt triggered. And so police would get called to respond. And once police knew them and knew a bit more about them, it kind of totally changed the way that they would respond. So instead of freaking out and talking about arresting and trespassing, they had a list of sort of supportive adults that they could call to come and help diffuse and de-escalate that young person so that they would just climb down from whatever they were on top of. And ultimately, they were able to suggest that like maybe this young person should join a climbing gym and have the opportunity to climb some things in a safer setting when they felt triggered. So yeah, that was a cool application where I saw restorative justice play out over time in a really creative way.
Yeah,
Strengths-based approach, natural incentive.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, things both of you are talking about, if you don't mind me jumping in, I think I just want to acknowledge some things you said, Ramone. You said, having a restorative mindset, and spoke to how personal the work is. And I think even in the story that you told, Dana, you were talking about this police officer who actually overrode that sort of training to pause and sort of like feel this situation, to make the connection from their own child to the child before them. And I'm just struck by the sort of human dimension of this work, and without being too woo about it, like the spiritual dimension of this work, the need to self-reflect, and some things you were speaking about earlier, Ramone, about culturally that we live in a world where it's difficult to apologize, where apology gets conflated with shame. When it came out, I read Patrice Culler's book, An Abolitionist Handbook. So Patrice Culler's, I'm sure you all know, is one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, and is no stranger to really confrontational experiences with law enforcement and even Homeland Security and all these things. But I was really struck in this book by how much she just talks about interpersonal relationships and creating art and having difficult conversations with people she loves and coworkers and her mom, and being willing to sit in that fire of what am I accountable for? What needs do I have? And that's sort of slow, embodied, reflective work that culturally we don't make a lot of space for. So I just wanted to reflect back. I was struck in both of your stories about that component. And in a way, I was thinking about the need for creativity in this work. I think what you were both saying, right? Go join a climbing gym. And we have these narratives for what is going to be like this sort of A to B to C kind of outcome based formula that gets sort of baked into certain narratives. But when we can get outside the box a little, there's more creativity, which maybe in a roundabout way, and Dana knows this is an issue close to our heart. I also think about the role of restitution in restorative, in sort of the sort of classic restorative justice framework, and restitution is often considered a restorative practice as part of the doing sorry, the component of active accountability and repairing harm. If we, of course, presuppose that a person is accountable, right, have actually caused that harm. But when you dig beneath the surface of these narratives, first of all, in our system, we do a lot of assuming we know what survivors want and need. And we don't always actually center asking them. And survivors need a lot of things, and survivors are diverse, more diverse than we often characterize them to be. And they are entitled to a lot of things, answers, having their pain acknowledged, a sense of safety, and maybe in some cases, yes, financial repair to losses incurred by a harm. But often, when surveyed, what survivors want is that people are held accountable through alternatives to incarceration, like mental health and addiction treatment, community service, rehabilitation, education programs, etc. And if we really hold true to this principle in restorative justice of taking care of all parties, those harmed as well as those who've been harmed, how we do restitution right now, at least, that model sort of falls apart. Here in Mirror Image Arts, we've discovered that a lot of the kids in the system owe thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Kids in the system owe hundreds of thousands of dollars, not just to the individuals they've harmed, which I think that there's a lot of ways a young person could creatively repair that harm. But kids in the system are owing those kinds of numbers to companies and corporations. And I just think that there are ways maybe we could think outside the box where we're not necessarily burdening kids with these high dollar amounts. And, we live in this capitalist society in which we're just sort of assigning a monetary amount to something that's a really, again, interpersonal, emotional, spiritual process of repair and healing.
Thank you, Julie. And we seem to have some questions from the engagement. So we're going to look at those questions really quickly. The first question is, I'm wondering, what role or impact do teachers and educators have in disrupting the pipeline? What can we do in our individual classrooms?
I can jump in, and I'm sure everyone else. I know Mirror Image Arts works with young folks, so with some of our work that we utilize and work with educators is providing them the tools we like to label it or package it as for educators to be comfortable facilitating connection circles, and then also be comfortable engaging in restorative conversations. And that's simply just 5 restorative questions that you work through a tool we um, offer for educators, and then we give them the opportunity to practice and to find other ways to engage in restorative conversations and connection circles and allow for the framework. I believe that educators are they should be supported because I believe they could play a key role in helping disrupt the pipeline. When we think of relationship, and I've had opportunities to work with educators, and myself, I thought I was going to be an educator at one time, and you can ask an educator, are you in relationship with your classroom? And they'll tell you, yes, they are. But, proximity doesn't really mean relationship. I know my relationships with all my educators differed based on how I connected with that educator. And I would assume the same even for a 3rd grade class that loves their teacher. There's still going to be that handful of students that you don't quite connect with in the same way, where connection circles can create an opportunity for all young folks to have equity of voice and feel dignified. And it allows for the opportunity for the educator to then engage in restorative conversations before we get to any kind of punitive measures, to work out what is needed and create plans that suit the student's strengths and needs, that then later down the road, right, by modeling this and them having the experience and becoming more familiar with the restorative language, restorative processes and practices, when they become middle schoolers and high schoolers. And it's, that opportunity to engage in some risky behavior. Maybe now they've learned some skills along the way that allow them to draw those boundaries, right? Or to, take a step back and regulate themselves. Restorative practices is just a piece of, right, this pie of dignity that we can provide for each other in order to live in this need for compassion and connection. So I think educators are very key in disrupting that pipeline. They just need to be supported.
Ramon.
I can maybe add just a little bit, which is to say that I think if you're asking that question, that you're probably already doing a lot of the things, right, that disrupt the pipeline. I mean, I think I see educators all over Colorado that are doing some really cool things within systems, sometimes without a lot of support from the admin at their school or admin in their district, that are kind of acting as like comrades in costume to be a layer of protection for students, in as much as they're taking the time to have restorative conversations with students. If students have little blowups, they're taking the time to like stop and ask that student, how are you doing? How, like, what's going on with you? How, anything going on this week? Anything going on last night? Right? Like, just to sort of take a moment. I think another thing that when I've been in spaces where I've been working with young people, a thing that I have had to do from time to time, because sometimes other humans are going to push your buttons. If they're having a bad day, if they get escalated, they're going to do something and it's going to make you feel offended or hurt or scared or threatened. I have to like take a time out. I have to remove myself from the situation and not act when I'm in that red zone of feeling like frightened or embarrassed or disrespected. So the best thing I can actually do is to sort of say like, okay, not gonna decide how best to address this right now, other than sort of saying I need a few minutes, maybe even remove myself from the situation for about 15 minutes so that I have the time and space to get out of my lizard brain. And if I need to call another adult who wasn't just disrespected or dysregulated by the interaction to come and decide what happens next, then I do that. And so one of the best things I think you can do is figure out who your support people are in your school, so that if something happens and you feel like I need somebody to come and be my support person so that I can support this student because right now I'm pissed and I can't. That's 100% okay. And so that person doesn't have to be an SRO. It might be, right? If you have a really wonderful SRO who you trust to come in and diffuse or de-escalate, but it might just be another teacher, it might be an administrator, it might be a social worker, might be another student, right? But kind of identifying who that network is so that you can give yourself a moment to pause before you have to respond to a student's behavior out of a place of anger.
Thank you, Dana. This next question I'm going to hand to Julie. From your perspective, how open or not are Colorado DA judges to shifting from punitive systems of accountability to alternative methods?
I'm happy to take this, and I'm going to invite Dana's insights as well. Well, I can't say that I know all the DAs around, but I've had a handful of conversations with some. The thing is, there's complexity there. The district attorneys themselves are elected, and that has politicized their roles in a lot of ways. And they're under pressure to report on the numbers, right? And as maybe their constituency is getting sort of whipped up into a fear-based sort of posture about this sort of abstract sense of crime or public safety or something, then they have to sort of be accountable to arrests and prosecutions. And so I just want to recognize with all these systems, with DYS, departments of corrections, schools, district attorney's offices, these are institutions comprised of human beings. And there might be some really well-meaning human beings who are sort of embedded in these really complex, nebulous, non-transparent systems. And so it takes more than just maybe a single person or a single DA to unravel all of that. And I will say, I don't know how receptive a lot of DAs are. They get a lot of funding for a lot of their programs, right? A lot of it is hard to divorce from these other sort of incentive models they exist in, I guess, as elected leaders, and then how their offices are funded, et cetera. And I will also say, I've met with a couple of DAs who were impressively receptive to trying a new model. And to my point earlier, they just didn't really know what that was. They didn't have a lot of options. They want results and they want evidence-based models, but they are stuck in a mindset that doesn't really enable them to sort of think outside the box or get creative, and they have a ton of pressure on them. So that's my sort of general answer. But Dana, I'd welcome, or Ramone for that matter, I think you both are in a relationship with DAs, judges, et cetera, in ways maybe I'm not.
All right, so we are going straight into transformative justice. So thank you all for your beautiful, beautiful answers. Julie, if you could go in and introduce this concept of distributive
Sure.
justice into this
Yeah.
conversation and then tackling
Yeah.
transformative justice.
Yeah. I think maybe just one thing to sort of put a pin on the question about DAs, though, maybe I'll invite everyone who's on this call to contact their district attorney's office and ask them how receptive they are to alternatives to punitive justice, because, of course, everyone here is a stakeholder, actually, and we have a right to know. They are accountable to us. They work for the people. And so, though my answer might have been a bit thin, I just want to invite everyone here that there's no reason they can't go ask themselves, and I'd encourage them to. Anyway, moving on. Yeah, so transformative justice, and there's this more kind of philosophical concept also of distributive justice, and maybe these kind of go hand in hand. So when I first heard this concept of distributive justice, it's really about how do we sort of allocate resources and spread the burden of harms
So
beyond just an interpersonal bubble, like a one-to-one, one individual harms, another individual is harmed. Restorative justice does this as well. But with transformative justice, we're really incorporating also an analysis of root causes. So where restorative justice maybe works with a little bit more of a formalized process and can work within institutions and systems, historically transformative justice has worked outside of formal systems, but it's been people supporting other people in addressing harm. And I just want to shout out to a number of folks who have been sort of pioneers in this work, like Generation 5, Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, Mia Mingus, Miriam Kaba, and Project Mia. And a lot of these folks are queer, people of color, people with disabilities, who are starting from the grassroots up to transform how we do justice altogether. So it's both preventative and responsive. So it's putting the needs of the community, the person harmed, and the person who caused the harm at the center of the process, and also incorporates an awareness of legacies of oppression as well, and tries to address those root causes. I think about transformative justice being something that maybe we can achieve over multiple generations. And it can be an imaginative state. It can be iterative, and there's sort of a horizon of abolition in our micro and macro relations. And so examples of what transformative justice might look like is a lot of what folks were saying about like investing in relationships, in teachers. It might look like really deep, integrated anti-bias or de-escalation training for law enforcement, and decreasing law enforcement in our communities, and instead reinvesting in community. I'll give a few examples. There's a program here called the STAR program. Many people probably know about it. One of the first programs was called Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, where social workers are called in to respond instead of police when there's maybe a mental health crisis or somebody who's not doing so well out in public. Instead of sending the police in and having that potentially escalate, trained social workers are sent out to offer supports. And anytime you're looking at wraparound supports, that could be a transformative justice practice. There's also, I know it was started in England, and I believe they've just piloted a hotline here for people who are have an inclination to perpetrating domestic violence. So this is for the perpetrators actually to call on the phone and try to sort of interrupt the impulse to act out, but instead to talk through, hey, this is a pattern, I'm feeling elevated, I feel anger, so that that's a case of sort of getting in front of harm before it even happens. Root causes of poverty, so building up systems of care, healthcare, education, support for families, access to healthy foods and nature, in, like investing in relationships and de-investing and disinvesting from systems of harm is transformative justice. And this distributive concept goes with that in thinking about, especially with young people, right? As adults, when a young person causes harm, it's worthwhile to examine how the adults in this young person's life have perhaps let that kid down, right? The teachers, the family, the whoever, and to recognize that we all have a stake in that young person's, that sort of as a member of the village in that person's life. And so if we're thinking about ways of sort of distributing burdens and reallocating resources, going back to my example about restitution, we might think about how could the community invest in alternative pots of money, some kind of public funds that could go into supporting people when they've been harmed and when they experience a material loss, rather than asking these kids to shoulder the financial burden. So I hope that's clear to everyone. I should say too, restorative justice and transformative justice share a lot of the same practices and the same philosophies. And I don't know that it's that helpful to get in the weeds or make it like a hierarchy of them. I think the key component that I see being pretty different in transformative justice is this sort of investment in root causes. And restorative justice tends to be really responsive, right? A recognition of harm. But I think there's a lot of ways you can kind of write that narrative and parse that. Oh, I think, Ramone, are you muted?
Yep, there we go. Sorry about that. I was, yeah, you had me in deep thought there. No, yeah, I'm with you on that. I like to believe some of the work we engage in can be classified as transformative justice, considering like when you speak around this experience. So, for example, we had some young men who were new citizens to America from Mexico, and one of them spoke English not very well, but the rest of them spoke Spanish pretty well, and not well, of course, their native language, but didn't speak English, couldn't really communicate in the English language, and they were had a law enforcement interaction. One of them was 21. The others were not, but they hadn't drinking any of the beers that the 21-year-old had purchased legally, and but they were driving around with these beers, and the law enforcement interaction was the fact that they were out past curfew in a park, and minors with alcoholic beverages, where these beverages they were empty and in the proximity of these young men. But the young men, once what we learned in the pre-conference was there was another group of youth also there that allegedly threw beer cans at them. And when the law enforcement interaction happened, the law enforcement officers that approached them let the other young folks go, and then just cited them with the referrals to our program. So you can imagine these young men, cultural difference, didn't understand, right, why it was even illegal to have the beverages and the idea of curfew, because there's no legal drinking age where they came from. And that stuff doesn't matter where they come from. So there was that misconception there, and they automatically felt singled out, because the initial officer that approached them, from their experience, mentioned that this officer, they felt he was disrespecting them. And the other officer that responded spoke Spanish, and they felt like treated them with dignity. That was the officer that participated in our circle for these young men. There was a lot of pre-work done to help them understand. There was like an educational piece needed as well. So when we talk about the fact that they were referred to our process, and now we're going to have them hold themselves accountable for the ticketable offense, are we to hold them accountable even though they believe that those other young folks should have been there as well but didn't get a ticket? And it's no coincidence these young folks happen to be European descent Spanish speakers, but members of the community whose families had been a part of the community for a while. So there supposedly, allegedly, right, there was some racial slurs thrown around and beer cans thrown at them. And these young men were proud of themselves for not getting to a fight and didn't understand why they were having this law enforcement interaction. So we, within our partnership, we have to hold these young men accountable, contract agreements, and then a judge signs off on that. And then if they complete that contract, then there's no record that goes forth for them to have to deal with for the rest of their life. If not, then it gets referred back to the municipal court, in which then they get the fines in the traditional system. So, in order for these young men to truly hold themselves accountable for what had happened, we had to hold space for them to be able to share their truth. And we prepared the law enforcement officer that they would possibly share that truth within the accountability circle. And they did. And that law enforcement officer was prepared and sat in that moment, in that space, and heard them out. And that's what those young men needed. And they learned something new about the systems that exist and what may happen to them. And then it was an opportunity, because I was a part of that particular conference, for me to connect with them as a Black person to brown folks. And that was an opportunity for me to, in that moment, allow insight for that law enforcement agent also to understand that even though I haven't had many law enforcement interactions, the ones I have had have all mainly been due because I'm Black, right? Like, I've been stopped in my own neighborhood, right? Because I was out leaving a friend's house late. And once I told this officer where I lived and asked him for a ride home, he just said, "Have a good night," and drove off, right? So it's an opportunity for them to understand that even though it may be unfair that these things may happen, therefore the approach I used to take and still do take is, how do I not have a law enforcement interaction?
Mm. Thank you, Ramone, for saying that, and also putting back the responsibility on us as well as a community to come forward and see what we can do and how do we bring healing into the space. With that, because of time, we are going to give us one last question that I would like to direct towards Dana. I'm wondering, Michael is wondering, I should say, what does a world where restorative and transformative justice is the only justice look like? Do you believe this world is achievable? Why or why not?
Yes, I believe it's achievable. And the reason I believe that is that I work with young people who have been directly impacted by the justice system, by the crimmigration system, by the education system, by the foster care system, by all these systems that are often oppressing youth that are supposed to serve them. And yet, young people come up with ideas every day for what they envision as a safe and just and healthy community. And so, of course, I believe that it's achievable. I think that it starts with kind of approaching well-being and security from a public health perspective, and from recognizing that folks need space to not only have food, shelter, clothing, healthcare, access to education, but also have a say in what that education looks like, what the curriculum looks like, who participates in that system. That communities are often in a position to develop plans for safety that utilize the human resources that we have within neighborhoods, within cities, in ways that might be akin to some of what's going on in Longmont. I also live in Longmont, and so Longmont is a spot in Colorado where there's some really cool things happening in terms of like law enforcement working with organizations like Longmont Community Justice Partnership and Rewind to actually just decriminalize behavior that they could treat as a crime. And instead of treating it as a crime, they're treating it as an opportunity to have an interaction with a young person and either sort of refer them to LCJP if that's the appropriate course of action, or connect them to Rewind so that they and their family can be resourced. So sort of using our discretion in whatever position we're in, whether we're educators or parents or youth who, all youth sort of have some level of influence on other youth, to respond to situations in ways that recognize people's humanity and help them get the things they need. And I think most of us need the same things. Like I need grace when I make a mistake, and I need love, and I need attention, and I need food, and I need sleep, and I need to be able to keep myself healthy. And those are the things that I think allow us to create like true restorative and transformative justice when we're looking out for one another's basic needs and recognizing one another's humanity, and then forcing systems to do the same.
Thank you, Dana. And thank you, audience, for engaging with excellent questions. Ramone, Julie, and Dana, thank you for this fantastic conversation. I have one last question for each of you to answer. The United States spends $80 billion annually on the broad system for imprisoning people. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this spending. Can we imagine a world where this spending does not exist? If we could create a world where you had $80 billion, what would you do with that money instead? Audience, feel free to put what you would do with $80 billion in this system.
I would love to jump in and take and this also maybe a little bit addresses the question Michael asked too. I just also want to say, yes, I think it's possible. And with the caveat that we, as culture, have to reckon with the legacies of violence and white supremacy, like before we can ever get there. And that I think it's going to take time, generations perhaps, to live in a world where transformative and restorative justice are the only options. But okay, I have $80 billion. I would probably say that we would definitely have arts programming in schools. Okay, so let's say that. But I think $80 billion goes a long way. It doesn't solve everything, but I think that there would be safe and affordable housing available to people. I think that there would be healthy and fresh food available for all, solving maybe food deserts, and mechanisms or pots of money where people don't have to choose between paying their rent or accessing healthcare. And yeah, I mean, I think part of me is like, oh, it would be great to live in that world. I'm imagining like trees growing out of concrete and, birds and butterflies, where we have $80 billion spent in other ways. But I think that I would spend that money investing in human beings, and they're starting with basic human needs. And over time, with that investment, ultimately ways that humans could, in much the same way Dana was talking about, engage in human-centered and meaningful work and start to heal from capitalism. But again, it might take a little time. Yeah, basic universal income, John.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's a great one. You stole my idea. Yeah, I would. I like to dream about this, so I would probably invest in supporting schools with whatever it is that within those communities they say they're needing. I think there's a lot of communities and a lot of organizations and a lot of trusted messengers in communities doing a lot of great work that don't get the support that they deserve or support that they could utilize to really make an impact for organizations and communities to make a shift. I think nationally, if we support and invest in communities and organizations that are doing the work on a local level, that makes a national, what do they call that, needle mover. I think that is the step in the right direction of cultivating beloved community. And that idea then is like everyone has all that they need in order to thrive. The idea of folks not needing to survive is that there's no need for greed and there's no need to steal when you're hungry if you're never hungry. So I just invest in those folks that are already doing the work.
Yeah, I think the only thing I can sort of add to that is that we have to recognize that people have a right to feed their families. Um, and we have to invest in a wide variety of strategies that promote public health, particularly in communities that have been marginalized, right, intentionally. Um, and I think that there is space and need for actual reparations, right, for communities that have been subjected to intentional and systemic divestment or genocide. And I also think that there's just a need to give people pathways to be able to build community organizations or continue to grow community organizations that provide culturally rooted celebration, art, communication, gathering spaces, services, support, those things that are integral for humans to thrive when we're living among other humans in cities or in towns. Um, and I also think that we need to pay folks who work for nonprofit organizations or government entities or in any public service capacity the same living wage that we pay folks who might be in a union, right? Because that way people don't have to become probation officers or prison guards in order to feed their family, or they will no longer think of it as that binary. I mean, I think a lot of the people we were talking about DAs and like some of the youth that I've been working with lately have pointed out something that's sometimes even hard for me to see, which is that when the district attorneys fight tooth and nail to retain their authority to prosecute 10, 11, and 12-year-old children, they're not doing that because they love locking up 10-year-olds. They might be doing that because they are thinking about keeping the 10 or 20 people on their payroll who currently run their diversion programming for youth. They're thinking about how they're going to be able to continue to employ those folks. And they're not thinking about all of the ways that subjecting children to prosecution at any level creates harm. And so we have to be able to invest in pathways for people to support themselves and envision a future for themselves and their families that aren't grounded in subjugating other people.
Thank you. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, my beautiful panelists, for doing this beautiful conversation with me. Thank you for all of you who have joined us. We are hoping that we move forward from this conversation to commitment. So here's a few ways you can do that. You can actively support young people by engaging in our advocacy work here at Mirror Image Arts. We'd love for you to sign up to receive our newsletter and get action alerts. Use your voice. Share what you learned tonight any way you can. Have conversations with your loved ones and friends. Last but not least, if you are able, help us reach our $25,000 collective giving goal by investing in young people like Dyson and Jason through a gift of any amount. Every gift and giver is appreciated and valued. There's a link in the chat box or video description. You can also hold your phone camera to the QR code on the screen. We are in this together and cannot accomplish our mission without your help. Thank you to every individual who has already given. Before we sign off, I want to thank our panelists again, Ramone Sanders, Julie Rada, Danielle Walters Flores. I also want to give a huge thank you to Danny at Captive Brand, Reanimate, Intelligent Demand, Maddie Hyken and the DU Evaluations Team, Longmont Community Justice Partnership, and National Center for Youth Law. And thank you, our online audience, for joining us. Take care of each other and let young people in your life know that their voice matters.